You've been told that awakening brings peace, that seeing deeper truths about yourself and others leads to clarity, joy, and lightness of being. But Jung uncovered a darker law of the psyche. The moment you see what others cannot, you enter danger. Not because the truth is poisonous, but because society itself cannot bear the mirror you hold up. It wasn't madness that drove people into breakdowns. It was clarity. It wasn't confusion that hollowed them out. It was the unbearable weight of seeing too much. Carl Jung wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Yet what he left unsaid, but lived through with patient after patient, is that when you do make the unconscious conscious, the crowd often turns on you. Because what you expose isn't just your own shadow, it's theirs. Think of the empath who has spent a lifetime absorbing everyone's pain. They don't collapse from weakness. They collapse from carrying the unspoken grief of entire families, workplaces, even cultures. Jung discovered that such people are not fragile at all. They are overloaded instruments of perception. And when they finally stop apologizing for their vision, the entire structure around them begins to quake. They see the lies in the family that never fights, but also never loves. They sense the hunger of people who feed on their light while calling it love. They feel the distortion of shadow projectors who rewrite reality with absolute conviction. You are not unraveling because you are broken. You are unraveling because your psyche is too honest to play along anymore. Jung called this individuation, the terrifying birth of the true self, tearing through layers of masks and illusions. To most of the world, it looks like collapse, but in truth, it is the beginning of sovereignty. So here is the paradox that will frame everything we explore. The danger is not in blindness, but in sight. The peril is not in being asleep, but in waking up in a world that rewards sleep. And yet, Jung's hidden notes reveal that those who survive this passage do not return weaker. They return unbreakable. Not saints, not martyrs, but beings who can no longer be manipulated, drained, or deceived. That is where we are heading. But first, we must descend into the traps, the projections, the shadow basements that Jung mapped so meticulously. Only by walking through them can we understand why the awakened are feared, why they are called dangerous, and why their presence alone changes everything. What I am about to reveal is not a set of comforting affirmations. It is a map of the very forces that undo most people before they can ever stand in their own light. Jung discovered patterns that repeat with surgical precision. The empath drained until they snap, the awakened soul emptied of all motivation, the rare mind convinced it is defective, the shadow projector who rewrites reality and drags others into their delusion. You will see why the person you cannot keep, your so-called soulmate, may not have been a mistake, but the most dangerous and necessary initiation of your life. You will see why emptiness after awakening is not failure, but the chrysalis of a truer purpose. You will see why being too sensitive was never weakness, but evidence of evolutionary advancement. This isn't casual knowledge. To glimpse these truths is to risk isolation, because once you recognize the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Families fracture, friendships turn brittle, lovers recoil. Jung called this the fate of differentiation. The one who awakens must walk a road others fear to admit exists. And yet, if you endure this passage with consciousness, something extraordinary happens. The empath who once absorbed poison becomes immune to it. The person abandoned by the unkeepable one discovers that love was never meant to be possession, but initiation. The seeker who thought awakening destroyed their motivation finds a deeper current of soul-driven purpose waiting beneath the ashes. Because here is Jung's most unsettling and liberating insight. The psyche does not care about your comfort. It cares about your wholeness. What you will gain from this journey is not a philosophy, but a shield. Not a retreat into safety, but a map for walking straight into the fire without being consumed. By the end, you will know the names of the traps, the signs of projection, the stages of integration. You will recognize when the unconscious is recruiting you into a role you did not choose. And more than recognition, you will have the practices, the rituals, the scripts, the disciplines that turn danger into transformation. So, let us move forward, not into fantasy, but into the most terrifying truth of all, that you already have within you everything needed to walk this path. What you lack is not strength, but sight, and Jung's life's work was devoted to giving you precisely that. To understand why some loves are not meant to last, you must first meet one of Jung's most unsettling case patterns. In Zurich, Jung worked with patients who came not because they were loveless, but because they had loved too much. One in particular described a relationship that seemed more like destiny than chance. The dreams before meeting, the uncanny synchronicities, the sense of knowing the other person from lifetimes past. To both, it felt eternal. And yet within 2 years, it had collapsed under impossible pressures, distance, conflicting paths, the stark realization that devotion alone could not weave a life together. At first glance, it resembled failure, another tragic romance, another heartbreak to be filed away with countless others. But Jung noticed something that disturbed and fascinated him in equal measure. This patient was not destroyed by the loss. They were transformed. Their voice, once timid, carried authority. Their vocation, once avoided, became urgent. They began writing with clarity, speaking with conviction, building what they had long feared to build. This wasn't recovery, this was ignition. Jung recognized that what had ended was not just a love story, but the false self that had survived by hiding in dependency. The relationship, short-lived though it was, had served as what he called an initiation through eros, a sacred fire designed not to warm you forever, but to burn away what you could never shed on your own. Consider your own life. Perhaps there is someone you could never quite keep, someone whose absence still aches like a phantom limb. You may believe that their departure was the wound, but look closer. Has it not also been the very pressure that forced you into new dimensions of yourself? Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. What he left unsaid but demonstrated in case after case was that sometimes the reaction is so volatile that containment is impossible. The container breaks, but the new element remains. This is why Jung warned his students never to confuse intensity with permanence. Some encounters are designed not to remain, but to remake. The patient whose life seemed shattered by love's withdrawal was, in fact, undergoing individuation, the psyche's ruthless demand that the true self be born, even if the price is unbearable loss. So we return to the paradox. The one who breaks you may also be the one who completes you, not as a partner, but as an initiator. If we are to walk further, we must sharpen our language. Vague words blur reality, and Jung warned that what cannot be named cannot be integrated. So let us give precision to these forces that so many mistake for romance or fate. Initiatory soulmate. This is not the partner of your lifelong domestic dream. It is the figure who constellates the deepest patterns of your psyche, often awakening capacities you did not know you possessed. They arrive like fire in dry grass, sudden, overwhelming, and transformative. Their role is not to stay, but to initiate. You do not measure them by duration, but by depth. Fate bond versus trauma bond. Most confuse the two. A trauma bond is forged in secrecy, shame, and cycles of pain. It is compulsion masquerading as destiny. It contracts your world, leaves you smaller, weaker, endlessly orbiting someone else's wound. By contrast, a fate bond expands you. You feel more alive, more courageous, even in the midst of conflict. Jung observed that in true initiatory bonds, the psyche does not collapse into chaos. It reorganizes around a higher pattern, individuation. This is the heart of Jung's psychology, the process by which you become a whole person, not a fragment wearing masks. Individuation demands confrontation with shadow, integration of opposites, the descent into what alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, where the old self dies before the new one can be born. Every bond of great intensity is measured by one question. Does it accelerate your individuation, or does it drag you back into unconscious repetition? Because here is the chain of inevitability. The self uses relationship as its sharpest tool. Because the ego will not move voluntarily, the self recruits the one person you cannot resist. And because you cannot resist them, you are forced to face what you never would have faced alone. This is why your greatest heartbreak often conceals your greatest threshold. What looked like collapse was individuation in disguise. What looked like betrayal was the psyche breaking its own chains. We now have our terms. With them, we can see not just the story, but the structure. And once you see the structure, you will never again confuse a soul initiation with a mere wound. You see their face before you meet them, in dreams, in stray visions, in the flicker of imagination that feels less like invention and more like memory. You sense time itself bending around them. Hours stretch into lifetimes, days collapse into minutes. Every encounter feels outside the clock, as though fate itself had scheduled the meeting. You feel taller in your own life when they are near, suddenly braver, clearer, more alive. And then when they pull away, you feel smaller than you ever imagined possible, as though the ground itself has been stolen from under your feet. You notice courage rising where there was once only hesitation. Words pour from your mouth that you did not know you had the strength to say. Choices you feared for years suddenly seem unavoidable, inevitable. You remember a self you thought was long dead. Passions resurface, creativity bursts, truths you buried begin to breathe again. This is not accident. It is archetype in motion. Jung wrote that such encounters constellate the unconscious with terrifying precision. They are mirrors and magnets, excavators and igniters. And when they strike, you do not experience them in thought alone. You see, you sense, you feel. Jung insisted that we must never confuse archetypes with individuals. The same figure that appears in your life as a beloved may, in truth, be carrying a function far larger than themselves. To see this clearly is to reclaim your freedom. To mistake it is to suffer unnecessarily. So let us name the 4 primary functions of the initiatory soulmate. 1. The mirror. This one reflects back the unlived parts of you. You fall for them because they carry what you have denied, your daring, your sensuality, your hunger for freedom. Every encounter feels charged because you are not only seeing them, you are seeing yourself refracted through their being. The danger, confusing projection for partnership. The gift, integrating the qualities you once outsourced. 2. The key. This one unlocks a dormant function within you. Jung called these inferior functions, the hidden side of personality you avoid. Perhaps you are rational, and they unleash your creativity. Perhaps you are cautious, and they ignite your courage. Keys often do not stay. Their purpose is to turn the lock, to awaken what you would not awaken alone. 3. The threshold. This one appears at the crossroads of your life. They force you into decisions you cannot defer, career or vocation, safety or destiny, comfort or growth. Their presence is the storm that blows you off the familiar path and onto the road of individuation. You may remember them not for how long they stayed, but for the irrevocable choice they demanded. 4. The firekeeper. This one sets aflame not the relationship itself, but the path it points toward. They awaken devotion, not necessarily to them, but to the vocation, the art, the calling that erupts once they touch your soul. You may never keep them, but their fire keeps burning in your life's work. Because here is the inevitability. Each type carries an archetypal task. And because the psyche does not waste encounters, the one sent to you was not random. They were function. They were medicine. Jung observed again and again that the tragedy was not in the loss of the figure, but in the failure to integrate the function. The mirror rejected leaves you chasing endless replicas. The key ignored leaves you locked in your old shell. The threshold denied leaves you wandering in circles. The firekeeper forgotten leaves your vocation cold. This wasn't romance as culture sells it. This was initiation, and initiation is always costly. Now we arrive at the cruelest paradox of all. If these encounters are so transformative, why can't they last? Why would the psyche design a bond that feels like forever, yet collapses before forever can arrive? Jung's answer was merciless in its clarity, because permanence would dilute the very fire that forges you. The self does not send you comfort, it sends you catalysts, and a catalyst by nature is consumed in the process it initiates. Because the ego resists growth, therefore the psyche recruits eros, love itself, as the irresistible force to break down your defenses. Because you would never willingly dissolve your masks, therefore the bond is constructed to feel fated, undeniable, archetypal. Because you cannot integrate shadow in safety, therefore you are thrust into intensity where illusions burn too fast to be maintained. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation as a divine compulsion. You did not choose this encounter. It was chosen through you, by the unconscious pattern of your own becoming. The impossibility, distance, timing, vocation, circumstance, is not accident. It is the surgical instrument of the self. If the bond were easy, you would sink into complacency. If it were permanent, you would confuse the person with the archetype. It is precisely because it cannot be held that it breaks you open. Look at your own story. The one you could not keep. Did they not activate a fire in you that still burns? Did their absence not demand that you carry the flame yourself? Jung would say, the relationship did not end. It transmuted. The figure left, but the function remains. Here is the inevitability. The self prioritizes transformation over possession. What you loved in them was not theirs to give. It was yours to awaken. And once awakened, it can never be taken away. Jung warned that to meet the initiatory soulmate without consciousness is to step into a fire that can consume you rather than transform you. 3 dangers, in particular, return again and again in his case notes. 1. Mythic fixation. You begin to worship the person as if they were the archetype itself. You confuse the mirror for the self, the key for destiny, the threshold for salvation. Instead of integrating the qualities they awakened, you chase the figure endlessly, waiting for their return, as though keeping them could preserve the fire. Jung called this inflation by projection, the soul lost in its own image, mistaking outer form for inner truth. 2. Projection loop. Rather than owning the unlived parts they stirred in you, you demand they continue carrying them. You see in them your courage, your creativity, your intensity, and instead of claiming it, you become dependent on them to embody it. When they withdraw, you feel emptied, as though your very self has been stolen. But Jung insisted, nothing essential can be taken from you. It was yours all along. 3. Meaning inflation. Here, the danger is subtler. Every synchronicity, every dream, every accident becomes interpreted as proof that this bond must be permanent. You inflate the archetype until reality itself buckles beneath your interpretation. Jung saw this lead to obsession, delusion, even collective madness when entire families or communities rallied around one person's projection. Because here is the brutal truth. The archetype is infinite, but the human vessel is not. To confuse them is to condemn yourself to despair. And yet, Jung never spoke these warnings to discourage. He spoke them as guardrails, boundaries that, if honored, allow the fire to purify rather than destroy. Jung did not leave us only with warnings. He left us with a process. He observed that initiatory bonds unfold like alchemical stages, not random, not chaotic, structured. And if you recognize the structure, you can cooperate with it instead of being destroyed by it. Phase 1. Contact. This is the ignition. The first meeting, the recognition, the fire in the blood. Jung wrote that Eros is a great mystery. It seizes you, not as a choice, but as a visitation. Here, your task is not to fuse, but to observe. Slow time. Write down your dreams. Notice what parts of you are stirred awake. Is it your creativity, your daring, your capacity for devotion? Already you are being shown what is yours to integrate. The mistake is to think the bond itself is the treasure. The treasure is what it constellates inside you. Phase 2. Crisis. Inevitably, reality intervenes. Distance, timing, conflicts of path. The ego protests. Why give me this, only to take it away? But Jung would insist, this is no theft. This is initiation. The crisis exposes what you have projected. You discover whether you were in love with a person or with a part of yourself you had abandoned. Here, grief is not an accident, it is a solvent. It dissolves your clinging, your illusions, your refusal to carry your own flame. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening phase, where the old self rots so the new self can be born. Phase 3. Integration. What remains when the fire dies down? This is the decisive question. If you clutch at ashes, you fall into fixation. But if you gather what was awakened, your courage, your creativity, your vocation, you transmute longing into purpose. Jung taught patients to ritualize this phase, to write unsent letters, to bury objects, to set vows not to the lost beloved, but to the path they revealed. This is where the archetype finally becomes yours. You are no longer haunted, you are inhabited. Because here is the causal chain. Contact constellates, crisis dissolves, integration consolidates. Skip one stage, and you remain trapped. Walk them all, and you emerge not diminished, but expanded. And this is the secret Jung left hidden between his lines. The bond that seemed to break you was never meant to last. It was meant to initiate you into your own becoming. Even when you recognize the structure, even when you name the bond as initiation, the path is treacherous. Jung observed 4 recurring pitfalls, each a way the ego tries to sabotage individuation by clinging to what must be released. 1. Recycling. You seek out replicas. Another mirror, another key, another threshold figure. You return again and again to the same archetypal fire, hoping that this time it will last. Jung called this repetition compulsion, the psyche endlessly replaying an unfinished task until you claim it as your own. The cure is not a new partner, but the courage to integrate the function. 2. Self-eraser. Instead of integrating, you collapse. You abandon your path, diminish your voice, twist yourself into the old shape in the desperate hope that the other might return. Jung warned that this is the surest way to betray the self. For the psyche does not bless self-betrayal, it punishes it with depression, anxiety, and emptiness. 3. Spiritual bypass. Here you dress your denial in sacred language. You call it divine timing. You insist that the universe will bring them back. But underneath, you refuse to confront grief. Jung was merciless about this. Archetypal energy demands suffering, not slogans. Without grief, there is no transformation, only delay. 4. Confessional relapse. Late at night, you reach for the phone, the email, the message. You spill out your heart again, hoping for response. Each time you do, you reopen the wound. Jung saw this pattern often, patients who could not resist confessing, only to re-traumatize themselves. His counsel was clear. Silence is not repression. It is containment. Containment is the vessel in which transformation brews. Because here is the truth. These pitfalls all orbit the same refusal, to carry the fire yourself. As long as you outsource what was awakened, you remain bound to the figure. Only when you claim it as yours does the bond fulfill its purpose. Jung warned that transformation is not a single event. It is a rhythm. Without practices, the psyche regresses, slipping back into fixation, projection, or despair. To remain integrated, you must give your fire a container, rituals that hold the archetypal energy without letting it consume you. 5 practices form the backbone of maintenance. Daily solitude, 20 minutes before the world intrudes. No screens, no voices, only silence in which you listen for the faint movements of the self. Jung said that without solitude, the unconscious has no chance to speak. Heat to form. Once a week, review what stirs most powerfully in you, grief, longing, creativity, and assign it a form. Write it, paint it, build it. If you do not give the fire a shape, it will burn you instead. Truth-telling friendships. Keep 2 companions who have earned the right to confront you. Jung valued what he called the psychological container, a trusted witness who can mirror back what you cannot yet see. Without this, you risk slipping into illusion. Embodied channel. Choose one practice that lets the body metabolize what the heart cannot. Running, breathwork, dance, martial arts. Jung knew the body is the unconscious made flesh. Ignore it, and the psyche revolts. Symbolic anchor. Retain one object that represents the function awakened in you, not the person, but the gift. A ring, a page of writing, a stone from a shared place. Let it remind you that the fire is now yours to keep. Because here is the chain. Rituals stabilize what revelation awakens. Without them, the psyche collapses back into chaos. With them, the archetype is not just survived, it is harnessed. Jung believed that psychology is not only lived in the clinic, it is enacted across history. When we look closely, we see 2 lineages, those who remained trapped in fixation and those who transmuted heartbreak into destiny. The cautionary figure. Think of Friedrich Nietzsche. He burned with visions of human transformation, but his personal life was marked by obsession with Salome, a woman who embodied the free, daring spirit he himself longed to claim. He could not integrate what she awakened. Instead, he clung to the figure, resented her independence, and spiraled into bitterness. Jung noted how unintegrated projection corrodes genius into pathology. Nietzsche's philosophy remains immortal, but his psyche collapsed under the weight of unclaimed shadow. The exemplary figure. Now consider Dante Alighieri. He encountered Beatrice only briefly, yet her presence ignited a vision that shaped the Divine Comedy. Dante did not possess her in life, but he carried what she constellated, the archetype of divine Eros, as a guiding star. He integrated the firekeeper function. Rather than chasing her in flesh, he followed her in spirit, and his vocation became the vessel for the bond. Jung praised such transmutation as the highest form of individuation. Eros sublimated into creation. Here lies the contrast. Nietzsche fixated on the person and collapsed. Dante integrated the archetype and built a world. Because here is the chain. The same fire that destroys one can forge another. The difference is not in the encounter, but in the integration. At this point you may be asking, how do I know whether what I lived was sacred initiation or mere entanglement? Jung gave us criteria, markers that reveal whether a bond is pulling you upward toward individuation or downward into unconscious repetition. Expansion markers. You find yourself more courageous, even in grief. Your friendships deepen because you can no longer tolerate surface exchanges. Your vocation becomes urgent. You feel compelled to create, to build, to express. Your body steadies, anxiety lessens as inner alignment grows. Entanglement markers. Secrecy dominates. You live a double life to sustain the intensity. Your world shrinks. Friends are lost. Vitality fades. Creativity stalls. Anxiety becomes chronic. The bond feels like compulsion rather than choice. You betray yourself repeatedly, lying, excusing, twisting your truth to preserve the other. Jung insisted on experiment, not mere reflection. He urged patients to remove pursuit behaviors for 10 days. No reaching out, no obsessive checking, no feeding of fantasy, and instead amplify path behaviors, writing, solitude, creation. Then watch what intensifies. Because here is the causal law. Truth strengthens in abstinence. Illusion withers without attention. If the bond is initiation, your energy consolidates around a new center. If it is entanglement, emptiness deepens when the other is absent. So you must ask yourself plainly, did this love make me larger, or did it make me smaller? The answer tells you whether you stood at a threshold or fell into a trap. Jung was no cynic. He did not declare that such bonds must always end, but he was precise. If they return, it is only under new conditions. The same pattern repeated without transformation is not reunion, it is relapse. Preconditions. Mutual individuation. Both must have walked through their own shadow. The bond cannot survive if one remains unconscious, clinging, demanding. Aligned timing. What was impossible before, career, geography, family demands, must now be resolved. Otherwise, the impossibility still serves the self, and the separation will return. Shared mission. Love cannot stand alone. Jung saw that when these pairs reunited in health, it was because they now served a vocation larger than the relationship itself. Guardrails. Radical transparency. No more secrecy, projection, or fantasy. Pace by integration, not chemistry. Eros may still burn, but it must be contained by discipline. Third space accountability, therapy, mentorship, or community that can hold the bond steady when intensity threatens to consume it. And if these conditions are not present, then the healthiest act is not to wait, not to cling, but to bless the bond for what it already gave and release it fully. Because here is the truth. If the fire returns, it will demand to know whether you have become its master. If not, it will burn you again. Your story is not only yours. Jung insisted that the individual psyche is always in dialogue with the collective unconscious. What you call heartbreak, culture calls myth. What you live privately, humanity has been staging for millennia. We live in an age that worships permanence, the endless marriage, the lifelong career, the fixed identity. Yet beneath that surface, culture itself is in crisis. Everything is shifting, fragmenting, burning away. The initiatory soulmate mirrors this collective condition. They arrive, they ignite, they refuse to stay. Not because something is broken, but because the pattern of our time demands transformation rather than stability. You are not alone in being torn apart by intensity that could not last. In truth, your personal fire echoes a cultural fire. Jung wrote that the world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. When individuals integrate what these bonds awaken, courage, authenticity, vocation, they feed strength back into the collective. But when individuals fixate, collapse, or bypass, society inherits their fragments. So understand, your integration is not selfish, it is cultural medicine. To claim the function, to carry the flame yourself, is to add wholeness to a world drowning in fragments. To mistake the archetype for a person is to repeat the cultural neurosis of clinging to what cannot last. Because here is the wider truth. Your heartbreak is not private pathology, it is initiation at scale. The self is not only birthing you, it is birthing a new culture through you. We began with a paradox, that the greatest danger was not blindness, but sight. That the bond which felt like destiny was never meant to remain, it was meant to ignite. Now you see why. The danger was never that you loved too much. The danger was that you mistook the initiator for the destination. The peril was never that you were broken. It was that you refused to claim the fire as your own. Jung's secret was simple and merciless. The self does not conspire for your comfort. It conspires for your wholeness. And if it must break your heart to break your mask, it will. So here is your commission. Identify the type of bond that struck you. Mirror, key, threshold, or firekeeper. Name the function it awakened. Write it, claim it. And then for 30 days, build one practice that anchors this awakening into your daily life. Let grief be honored, but let fire be carried. Because the danger isn't that you see too deeply, feel too fiercely, or love too intensely. The danger is that you fail to build a conscious relationship with that ability. Use it as cultural medicine, carry it not as obsession, but as vocation, and become part of what is next.